Thank you, Carol. What you see on the screen right now is was called a floating bath. So the history of my floating pool goes back to the 1830s, where they were down at the Battery. There were actually two floating baths. They were private, and you couldn't just jump in the water where there's tremendous currents. And it took about 20 years for the city, for the powers that be at that point. And these were basically the sanitarians who wanted to get the people who were living in the tenements clean. They didn't have a place to bathe. They didn't have toilets. There was just nothing. So they wanted to get them clean. They would also keep them from infecting other people in case they got sick. So this way they would be clean and they could go on with their lives. So they would come at the end of the day. The workmen, men, the pools were for men separately from women. So 2 days a week, it was 3 days a week, it was women, and 4 days a week, it was men. So this is a picture by Jacob Riis, who must have been taken about the 1830s. The first city floating baths were opened in 1880 by Boss Tweed, which I found politically wonderful because he got a lot of patronage from this. Anyway, Jacob Riis, as part of his work of selling the improvement of life for the people in the tenements, went around and took pictures of all of these pools. This is Ladies' Day at the pool. It's a little bit vague, but there's up here, there's somebody who's actually monitoring, this sort of like a policewoman, and the kids are sort of sitting in the edge, some of them afraid to go in. And then over here, they're actually beginning to swim. And in some of the pools later in the 1880s, 1890s, there was a swim teacher who came from the public education department who taught swimming. Okay, the next one, this was at the Battery. And this was a little bit later. It was two pools. So you had one for the men and one for the women, and it was quite large. I'm not sure if this originally was a private pool and then taken over by the city, or whether in the later years the city put two together. But so the pool is back here. Let me go back a moment here. This is water coming from the river. There were slats on the bottom and slats on the side of the pool, so the water could just rush in and rush out. People were not going to be taken, they couldn't be swept out into the tides. The only problem was it was dirty. At one point, all of the sewers entered into the rivers. And at one point, the health department, who wanted very much to get rid of these baths, put pink dye in a sewer, at the end of a sewer on the Upper East Side. And about 3 hours later, that pink dye ended up in one of these pools down at the Battery. So they closed them up. And you have to understand that we had no water supply before then. But by the time they closed them, that is, they encased them to keep the water out. And they brought fresh water from the Croton Aqueduct. Okay. So then and Regina and I will talk more about this, was able to go down to the Battery Maritime Building, where the Department of Ports and Terminals had left all of their records. And they started in 1880 with the founding of the Ports and Terminals Department. Wasn't called that in that time. And I came across these pools, these floating baths. And it was my eureka moment. And I said, one of the things I wanted to do was to bring more recreation to the city's waterfront, to open it up. The city is a city of islands, except for the Bronx. And people were living on these islands and had no idea that they were along the water. And so I wanted to do something that would bring people to the water. So taking this idea, I decided to build a floating pool. What I did is I bought a barge, and this is down in Louisiana. And it was a flat top barge that carried stuff on top of it. And we cut a hole. First of all, we had an architect, a land architect, whose name was Jonathan Kirschenfeld, and we also had a maritime architect whose name was Charles Cushing. They cut a hole just off the deck, and this hole is big enough for a 7-lane, half Olympic-sized pool. So this is Jonathan's work. Besides having the pool, we needed to have a place where the people could change their clothes. And so he dreamed of something like that. There were just a village of these tiny spaces. And this is what it looked like. So you have the pool down here. This is a second level. This is you go on a ramp from the changing room down the ramp into the pool, towards the pool. Into the ramp is this side. This is the edge of the pool. And each of these are the boys' changing rooms and the girls' changing rooms here. And then in this space here was offices for the workers, and also now they are actually providing lunch and dinner. Lunch and breakfast for the kids. Okay, this is Jonathan's village, which I love. I just love the colors. And this is still down in Louisiana. And in wait a minute. So first of all, it took 27 years for me to accomplish this. So 27 years is when I found the pool, the documents, and this was in about 2006 when the pool came to New York, and there she is. And somebody said to me, there was water in the pool. And I said, how do you know it's the pool? I said, I can see the water in it. And the water, it was actually rain that had happened. We brought it up out off in the Atlantic, and it got caught in a rainstorm at Cape Hatteras, and that was the pool water. So this is it opened. Let's see, it opened finally in 2007, and this was in Brooklyn Bridge Park. And Regina and I will talk about what this did for Brooklyn Bridge Park, which, as you can see, there's no World Trade Center. It's a rather interesting scene. And there's a fabulous view of the Statue of Liberty here. And okay, now we're moving to the Bronx, where what I wanted is for the pool to be situated in a recreationally underserved community. This was really very important to me. One, a community that didn't know that there was water in there that they could get to, and two, that they didn't have nearby pools that they could swim in. So this is the entryway to the one at Barretto Point Park. That's in the Bronx. It's just above the big Hunts Point. And Carol took this picture. She was out on the water, and I just love this because there it is. This is Barretto Point Park. This is the entrance. This is attachment to the land, and it's a beautiful, tiny, tiny little park, which was about 5 or 6 years old when we bought the pool here. And the community really, it's got the highest asthma rate in the city, and also the highest obesity rate. So just architecturally, wanted to show you that this is what it looks like. And this is wonderful places to sit back here, and sort of sunbathing, the chairs for the lifeguards, and a very wonderfully mixed community. Okay, when you come down, you come up from here, you go down, you go into, there's a space over here, and you reach the dressing. So you're coming in from there. There it is. You reach the dressing room. So this is the left side is the boys and the right side is the girls. So you go into the dressing rooms. And in an attempt to convince the powers that be that this was a useful thing to do, we decided to put in an educational component. And we got a grant these are the fish that used to swim in the East River. And here is the pool. And you can see you've got Rikers Island over here. And there's actually a floating jail, which I find very amusing. And this is the days before the big towers went up in Manhattan. And that's it. We can talk to Regina now.
I think a lot of people know Regina Meyer, who is the formerly, and until, am I right, 19, we're all going way back, 2016, the president of the Brooklyn Bridge Park, who was so kind as to take us on dirt tours before there was any landscaping or any trees, and Anne would always prevail upon Regina to give us a special tour of this evolving park. And so really literally from piers and a bit of landfill, every year we would get a special tour of the most recent additions to Brooklyn Bridge Park. And in the, let's see, it was only 6 years that you were there?
9.
9 years, nine years that you were there. It was a miracle within less than a decade's time, given the clear struggle of putting the quixotic goal of a floating swimming pool anywhere. Actually, the very first location for Anne's pool was pulled up right to a mooring at, and Anne can talk about and Regina can, the problems about that, to Brooklyn Bridge Park in the year just after Regina left, or in the months after she left. So I'm going to let the two of them go back and forth and talk about old times on the Battle of the Waterfront and some of the challenges. So Regina and Anne are going to have a kind of Q&A and conversation. And once again, I invite other people to contribute your own questions, and I can interject those.
Thanks, Carol, and thanks to Anne. It's really great to be here this evening. And it's a very special treat. Anne and I met at what was my first job.
And mine.
Okay. In the Koch administration, working at city planning, where we were both focusing on the very, very important desire for public access to the waterfront, which of course today seems so obvious. But I would say years ago, and we're dating ourselves a little bit here, the idea of public access was controversial, questioned, and really at other times just simply poo-pooed. And it was a time when I'd say the Koch administration was first focusing on the waterfront. They established a waterfront division within the Department of City Planning, and we were working on public access, both of us, which was really, it was an amazing time. But what I really wanted to talk about to start, because Anne's book is such a, I urge you all to buy buy and read Anne's book, is a incredible, beautifully written story of her quest to bring the floating barge to New Yorkers. And also within that story, she tells a very, very important story of how much advocacy she led to bring back New York City's waterfront. And so just to start off our conversation, I want to ask you, Anne, could you explain to us, and you showed us in some of the pictures earlier, what it was like to discover this incredible lost New York of floating barges?
Well, first of all, let me say it doesn't exist anymore. It's all been thrown out, all of those papers. My PhD professor at Columbia, Ken Jackson, was called down there by somebody from the Department of Ports and Terminals saying, we've got all of this stuff down here and we're about to throw it away. Would you like to come and look at it? So he spent 10 minutes down there, turned around and called me and said, Anne, get your ass down here. It was just, at that point, I think I was writing my dissertation. which was called Manhattan Waterbound. And again, the whole point is bringing recreation to the city. And in those days, early on. So there, it was, as I said before, my eureka moment. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of file drawers. And I'd open one and it would say, open the floating baths, open the floating baths. And I got the whole history, which is actually, there's a chapter in the book about where they were. There's a map of where they were. And there ended up to be about 15 at one point, all around, all in the Bronx and in Brooklyn and certainly around Manhattan. And that was, and then when they encased them and used no longer used river water, there were only 15 left. And Robert Moses had the last one, which he put on the West Side Highway as a sop to the neighborhood, who were very upset because they were building a highway along the Riverside Park, and they felt that their recreation was going to be taken away from them. So that's the story.
Incredible. And now you say that all of this documentation has been lost? Wow. Well, it's really wonderful that your book memorializes that very important history for New Yorkers.
I took a lot of notes. If they ever want to know, I know what was in every drawer and took notes about it. Notebooks full.
I want to remind the audience of something else that happened in the course of your advocacy and work for the waterfront. Just 3 weeks ago, Little Park opened on the west side. But it would be great to talk a little bit about your involvement with the West Side Task Force and how important this now another forgotten era in terms of waterfront advocacy. So why don't you tell the audience a little bit about that experience?
West Side Waterfront, when you and I were starting out there, was just derelict. The shipping had stopped, except that the people who worked in shipping were getting paid. They came and got paid every week because they had a contract that even if there was no work for them, they had to come and they got paid. And so that again, politically, this was, nobody in the government wanted to anger them because they were votes, but eventually they, little by little, they moved on. As hopefully you all know, shipping moved to New Jersey. And that was why they were so nothing. And so the governor and the mayor, it was Mayor Koch and Governor Cuomo father, created a task force to find out what to do with the West Side waterfront. There was a highway that was sort of elevated in front of these old buildings, and there were sort of warehouses, and the highway collapsed. And so there was no way to get down the west side. And this, what we did was we put together a report. We interviewed everybody, and the report was called something about the West Side Task Force. And in it, I convinced them to put in, let's put out a floating pool.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, you could see that from the West Side Task Force, so much has happened with the establishment of the trust. And of course, the years and years of dedication of so many people to build Hudson River Park based on that planning.
Yeah.
Let's get back to the pool, because obviously the pool is really the star of this story. Once you started to focus on bringing the pool to the New York Harbor, you spent years with public officials on both sides of both rivers to find a great location. So why don't you talk about that? Going from New Jersey, of course, and then back to Brooklyn. So why don't you brief us all on that incredible journey to find a location?
Well, it was a long journey and a complicated journey. Had a friend who lives in New Jersey, and he came to me one day and he said, "Ann, you know, we could use a floating pool here. We actually had floating baths just like they had them in New York, and we need one." And so I worked for 2 years with the mayor's office in Hoboken. And he was absolutely delighted, and he wanted, and we had a press conference, we're going to have it. And although Jonathan Kirschenfeld and I had said, well, we're going to open the first pool in 2000. Well, the people in Hoboken said, well, we can open it in 2002. I didn't have a pool. I didn't have the money. I just had an idea. But at the end of the second year, the mayor, who was in favor of this, was not reelected. And the next mayor couldn't have cared less. So I picked up my shopping bag, my backpack, and I came back to New York. Okay, where am I going to go? But that did give me the chance to start raising the money and putting together a board of directors and getting a fantastic attorney and to go on and on. So came to New York, and at that point, first stop was, well, I went to the Parks Department. I went to Henry Stern, who was then Commissioner of Parks. And I said, Henry, if I bring a floating pool to New York, will you take it? He said, yes, but I won't maintain it. You have to run it. Okay, all right. So I just went ahead. And then by the time I came back to New York, Adrian Benepe was the commissioner. And we had started out as young folks, both of us working in different areas of the Parks Department. And I went to him, I said, Adrian, if I build a floating pool and bring it to New York, will you take it? He said, yes. I said, will you maintain it? Yes. So I knew I had a home, but where was that home? I had someone who was going to take it and run it. So the first place Parks Department meeting, they said, well, we're going to be redoing Transmitter Park. You want to explain that park?
Sure. I mean, I think that what's so interesting about the Greenpoint and Williamsburg waterfront is that, like many other neighborhoods, the community, the idea of redeveloping the waterfront came first from the community. And the advocacy for redevelopment of Greenpoint and Williamsburg came first from the ideas that if the community didn't advocate for public access, the waterfront would have been redeveloped for mainly as of right waste transfer uses. This is a time in the 1980s and through the mid 90s when the highest and best use for so many abandoned industrial sites was for waste transfer. And the community in Community District 1 was so very focused on fighting waste transfer. They wrote 2 very, very cogent 197A plans. That's a technical term for a community-based plan that goes through a land use review process and requires approval. And not only did they write these 197A plans, but they also had incredible advocacy, marches, and other letter writing campaigns to the mayor and the governor at the time against waste transfer, which really set the stage for the city planning department to start to discuss rezoning the waterfront for residential use, which would obviously not permit waste transfer, and for public access. And where that came in and happily in the Bloomberg administration, when we started to focus on the redevelopment for Greenpoint and Williamsburg, we knew how important parks were to the community. This was a community where one of the major parks in Williamsburg, McCarran Park, had literally fallen into such disrepair that the pool was closed with no end in sight. So many community members knew how wrong that was. So the park that Anne got to focus on was a very, very important piece of the Greenpoint puzzle. Transmitter Park, which, and you should tell the story of what Transmitter Park was initially.
It was two enormous radio transmitters for NYC, I think it was, and they were dead. I mean, one of them actually fell down, and the Parks Department had, emergency, get it out of here, get it out of here. But the other one, there was no money in the budget to get it out, and the plan, the 198 plan, talked about getting rid of that. There's a wonderful old, what's the Art Deco house there that actually was just storing old statues and stuff. And the thing that I like the best is it has an incredible fig tree, enormous. And every year there were figs on it, and I ate them, no one else did. Anyway, so in the 198 plan, I noticed that they wanted to actually build something out into the waterfront. Like, aha, that's for us. They'll build a pier and we'll bring the floating pool there. The only trouble is they also said we want a ferry landing. And there's politics again. The community rightly got what they wanted, and that my pool had to go, or the idea of my pool had to go, and the community got a ferry landing. And but it took, this was in about 2005, 6, something like that. It didn't open until the park didn't open until 2012.
Right. And to be honest, residents of Williamsburg and Greenpoint are still having to advocate for open space. It's taken years for the city administration to make good on the promises to build Bushwick Inlet Park, which is south of there, of course, in Williamsburg. And this was a long, important battle in Brooklyn to provide open space on the Williamsburg waterfront. First, of course, started with the state, which bought the first 2 blocks, and then the city, which has been finally making important moves to build the remainder of the park. I guess the other thing we should talk about this evening is Brooklyn Bridge Park.
Right.
And this is a place that happily both of us had the incredible opportunity to work on. And I do have to correct Carol, because I worked at Brooklyn Bridge Park after Anne. And I think that that's a very, very important segue to this part of the conversation, because I wanted you, Anne, to reflect on both getting the barge and the pool sited at what was to become Brooklyn Bridge Park, but then let's talk after you talk about what that did for the park itself.
Exactly. When I wanted to bring the barge there, this is now, the barge is finished. I got the money. They dug the hole. You saw all of the pictures of what the architecture was, and you saw the picture of it landing at the Brooklyn Bridge. And so the state was nice enough to say, okay, you can come and land at these piers, which were run by the Port Authority, and the Port Authority hadn't yet moved out. But, in time, after all of the discussion, months and months and months, finally the Port Authority moved out. Okay, you can come here. We had to finish building the pool. We had to put pavers down. Things that we needed. We were afraid bringing it up, it would get caught in a windstorm and break it. Things would get broken. So, all right, we bring it in. There's a picture of the Brooklyn Bridge Park. And we're supposed to go over to Pier 1. No, it was Pier 3, I think it is. Pier 1 is now a combination of several piers. And we wanted to, start to turn to bring it, the tugboats were going to turn to take it over to Brooklyn Bridge Park, to the Brooklyn piers. And I get a telegram or not a telephone, a telephone call saying, you may not land. Why? Because Neptune hasn't proven that it's got insurance for its car. A floating pool, a car? Anyway, we didn't have a car. So that took about 24 hours till we finally wrote to them and said Neptune doesn't have a car, and affidavit for that. And I had to put the pool out in Staten Island. And this is very funny because when I got to Staten Island, that's where the tugboats had come from. I got to Staten Island and they began charging me a huge rent. Why were they charging me a rent? Because there was something called the floating hospital that used to be on the East River waterfront, and they needed a place to go, but they didn't have a place to go. So this is very familiar. And they came to these piers in Staten Island and never left. So at the end of a year where they were getting free berthing there, the owners said, so sorry, from now on, anybody coming there wanting free space, it won't happen. And a friend of mine who was really very, very helpful with this and friends with the owners finally convinced them that they should stop the tariff. So I only had to pay for, I think, 2 weeks. And then we only got back to Brooklyn Bridge piers, to Brooklyn piers. It was about probably nearly over a month because there were no towboats. At that point, they were trying to move the Intrepid, which had to get its bottom cleaned, and it was stuck in the mud. And they could not get it out. And every tugboat in the city and in New Jersey, and God only knows where else, was trying to get it out. So we had to wait for a moon high tide and for free tugboats to be able to take us. And then we arrived.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the DEC permit and how hard it was to convince the regulators that the barge is so important for the waterfront?
The Department of Environmental Conservation in the state has laws that don't allow, first of all, they don't allow something to be stationary in the water. So if I could move the barge from place to place, that wouldn't have been a problem, but I couldn't because there was no place to attach it except at Brooklyn Bridge Park. Sorry, at Brooklyn Piers, because there they had the water and they had the electricity and they had the waste treatment that we could attach because that had been used as a maritime center. And the state said, oh no, well, you have to prove to us that this is going to be not going to damage the environment. One of the ways it could have damaged the environment is that it casts a shadow. And there's a law that says, it's a federal law that says you may not cast shadows. It will kill fish. So in fact, they did a test, and that was actually when the pool got to Barretto Point Park, and they tested what was happening with fish. In fact, the fish loved to go under the boat. It was a place for protection. But the worst thing was when we were ready to open on pier, was it 676, something like that?
It was close between 3 and 4.
3 and 4. We were going to be there for 6 weeks, and the state said, you can't go there, you don't have a permit, or you didn't have a permit for working at the piers to finish the boat. And permit, I had decided, I knew that there was going to be trouble with them from day one, but I decided I was going to bring the boat to the city, permit or no permit, because if I didn't, it will never get done. And so we had a meeting and they said, we are going to fine you. First it was $50,000. This is Neptune, the foundation. It was reduced to $20,000. My board member said, no, you can't pay that. You can't pay that. I said, I'm going to pay that because if I don't, the whole project is dead. And I paid it. and we opened on 4th of July, or actually the 3rd of July.
Incredible, just incredible.
How about if I interject a
Yeah.
question here as well, and let me invite other people to add questions to the chat, because I'm not sure, Anne, that it's clear to our audience that this was a private effort, a not-for-profit that you established, and the whole mechanism by which you created this is, well, it's built on determination, basically, and your incredible hard work and tenacity in realizing the dream of it. But I think between the two of you, we have a wonderful example of people who were public servants who then led on different kinds of trajectories to realize a project. And I think it would be useful to, Regina, if you maybe add the frustrations within a government framework, but a public-private partnership, or at least a mechanism for funding, in order to clarify how these two things are different animals, but with a similar objective.
Sure, I'll take a crack at that. I mean, I think, Carol, you're right. I mean, one of the things that is so phenomenal about Anne's effort is that she was able to privately fundraise for an incredible gift to the city of New York.
I donated when we were finished in Brooklyn. I donated the pool to the city, to the Parks Department, and they run it. It's there. They own it now.
Yeah. So, when we all marvel at Barry Diller's little island and other great gifts, but for me, Anne's gift, although it was certainly a great gift to New Yorkers.
And the difference between this and the Diller is that the pool is free.
Well, it's free to go on Barry Diller's Island.
Right.
Yeah. I feel, I think, Carol, what you're also getting at here is how certain projects also need private involvement, and Brooklyn Bridge Park is certainly one of them. When the city and state decided to make the important decision to make Brooklyn Bridge Park a park, it was abandoned Port Authority piers. They did recognize how expensive that waterfront would cost, not just because of the cost of landscaping and utilities, but because building on the waterfront is so extraordinarily expensive. And Brooklyn Bridge Park, of course, was devised and approved based on a public-private model, which required private development to fund park maintenance and waterfront maintenance. And therein was at least a decade of controversy and lawsuits surrounding the actual development of Brooklyn Bridge Park. And when I took the job up at the state, the city and the state were lockstep wanting to build a park, and was still in several lawsuits. And I would say, and I would posit that the fact that Anne brought the floating pool to the park site, it was an abandoned waterfront then, at that point in time, was really a proof of concept that the park would be a success and that people really wanted public access to the waterfront. It was really the first time people ventured between Piers 1 at Old Fulton Street and to the south at Atlantic Avenue for recreation or access. And I don't know, before I talk a little bit more about the park, Anne, do you want to talk a little bit about what it was like to market and announce that the park, that the barge would be open, and how you worked to make sure that people would come to it?
Well, we marketed it by a James Barron arriving on the Brooklyn Bridge when the barge arrived. And we really just really wanted a New York Times article about this. And there he was. It took a picture, and it was in the Post. It was in the New York Times. It was, all over the place. And so that, it's here. People will finally be able to swim on the, Brooklyn waterfront.
Amazing.
And what I really love is when we closed just on Labor Day, the people who ran the pool um, put together a Festschrift, which is a little booklet with notes from people about what they thought. And actually that's in the book, some of what they said, but really what it said, bring it back, bring it back, bring it back.
Yeah. No, I would, reflecting on that time, really the timing could not have been better. Both Mayor Bloomberg and then Governor Spitzer really were lockstep in the idea
Yeah.
of bringing back the Brooklyn waterfront. And it took some time, but we knew that people would find their way. And without having the floating barge there that summer was really an important milestone.
Regina, I remember that you started digging holes within a couple of months after the pool left.
Yes, there were engineers on site that started, and that was really, it was really an important part of building the park was once my team was in place, was honestly to get started as soon as possible. From a staff level, and of course this was all approved appropriately, the instinct was if we didn't start building, the money would disappear. And I believe we were correct. We devised a phasing plan, which literally just spent everything we had in order to build as much park as we could within our current budget. And once those projects, the Pier 1 project and the Pier 6 playground were successful, I would say that really convinced Mayor Bloomberg to take over the park and to continue to fund it.
Yeah.
Well, are there other lessons learned over this long period? You certainly suggested, both Anne and Regina, how derelict, abandoned, and even controversial within the planning profession, the idea of bringing the waterfront back into public use. Are there over your careers, what would you say are the key changes? What works, what doesn't is a kind of typical question in order to ask someone or people who have had long experience. So what markers, what historical markers do you see, and what inflections, what changes have you seen along the way? What should we embrace? What paths should we take going forward?
You want to talk about the Brooklyn waterfront with all that housing that's going up where there's actually public access?
Sure. I mean, for me, New York City over the past 35 years, 40 years has changed so much. And I think, starting with the first part of your question, Carol, New Yorkers want to be outside and love the idea of being on the waterfront, playing on the waterfront. They want more from their parks as well in every single neighborhood. And what I think I really get from that, even in my current job today, is how important every neighborhood is to having a park, having open space, and people value that. And I think New York has come a huge way in that certainly wasn't a priority years ago. People depended, historically our profession depended on large destination parks and schoolyards as sufficient, and New Yorkers' attitudes has frankly evolved. Also, our housing demand has increased so very much as our population has grown over the past 30 years. And this isn't really, when you think of New York City coming out of the fiscal crisis of the 70s, New York City was shrinking. Our population, we were losing population to the suburbs and to other places in the United States. And the idea of permitting growth for residential was not even thought of as needed. And really, when I think about the Brooklyn waterfront in specific, I think one of the amazing things that happened, and one of the amazing lessons that I know we need to be thinking about moving forward is that now that we have a safe city and a city that welcomes immigrants and a city that wants people to come here, we have a housing crisis, and we have a housing crisis of affordability as well. And the advantage of rezoning the waterfront, and where there's many privately owned sites, is that housing became the highest and best use for those sites. Really at the same time that that Hunters Point was conceived, and that the New Jersey waterfront of Hoboken and other neighborhoods were. So to me, there's a very local lesson, of course, and there's also a regional lesson that as our city and our region grew, we needed those locations for housing.
And I guess one lesson to me, particularly for me, for Brooklyn Bridge Park, and also my work on the west side, West Side Park, what's that now called? Hudson River Park. The need to get people up in arms to asking for it. And the floating pool served 30,000 people 2 summers ago. And it was more than any of the intermediate pools in all of the Bronx. And the thing is that I can't remember what I was going to say there. Go ahead. Ask something else. I've lost my mind.
Sure. Dan, do you want to talk about the City Parks Department and how steadfast they were in their leadership to make sure that the barge went to Barretto Point?
Oh, that was so wonderful, because what happened when we opened in Brooklyn, Adrian wrote to me, and I was, waiting for a contract for him to run the pool that summer in like 2007. And I got an email from him saying, so sorry, we don't have the funds to do that. Because basically they didn't think it was going to happen, and so they didn't put it in the budget. But in the meantime, he said, we're going to open at Barretto Point Park next year. And how did he know that? Because the waste treatment plant there needed to expand. And the department in charge of that needed to do something to calm down the neighborhood to thinking that they're going to have more waste treatment, along the waterfront there. And they stepped in, paid for connecting the pool to the land, where they have electricity and water and waste treatment. And that's how it got there.
Anne?
Yes.
Oh, I think.
Did Anne freeze?
No, you froze, I think.
Oh.
So try another. Fine. Perhaps a final question, since we're coming up on 7 o'clock. So Regina, you had another question.
I wanted to ask you, Anne, just reflecting on this incredible journey that your career has taken, from understanding New York City's waterfront perhaps deeper than anybody else, to giving the barge to us. Reflecting on not just the advocacy, but the hard work. If there's anything you wanted to say to the next generation of people planning for the waterfront.
I think what I always say to people is, have a passion and follow your passion.
Oh, I see that we have, there's a question in the chat, but it relates to the plan for a larger pool in the park, in Brooklyn Bridge Park. I'm happy to answer that. What did happen is that it was found that to site a large pool adjacent to Brooklyn Bridge Park would be very problematic, because the park itself was already planned, and so many passageways and infrastructure, and so much so many backups for the pool would be required, that it would start to be a problem for the park itself. And that was a tough thing to realize. But every time we started to look at how we could shoehorn a very large pool in between a pier, there started to be another problem that we didn't initially anticipate in citing it. A lot had to do with health and safety regulations, if I'm not mistaken, as well as access in terms of health and safety, in terms of using the pool and cleanliness, and access in terms of simple fire safety. So that was really, it was very unfortunate. And I do know that my successors at Brooklyn Bridge Park are committed to building a pool in the park, but just not a floating pool. But it was really sad to learn that. But every time we studied another pier, more problems popped up than could possibly be solved.
Well, by way of concluding, and I guess in the spirit of the recent mayoral debates and the lightning round that comes at the very end, perhaps I can give you both the charge to make a short answer about future suggestions, of which there are proposals for floating pools that are floating around these days. Given your experience in a private pool that turns public, and a public-private partnership that turns into a park, do you think it's possible to create other floating pools, to multiply them around the city? And yes or no, and what would be the model for those?
Well, yes, we're going to follow Plus Pool if they ever can make sure that the membrane will let the water in and out. But they're still working on it, and they're working with the city. And I think they're going to have a demonstration this summer down at the Williamsburg Bridge. And the problem with a floating pool like mine is the state is only allowing 2 of these. That's the DEC. So a second one could be built. Their reasoning is they don't want floating refuse
on our teeming shores.
On our teeny shores. Yeah. They don't want floating housing. They don't want, they don't want to use up the river with something that's floating. Build it upland is what they say.
Yeah, I would say yes, and I would say that times are changing. Just to keep it to the lightning round, what we are now facing enormous crisis on the waterfront because of climate change. And when I look at what we now are going to face and what our successors are going to have to face, we're going to all have to be creative in terms of both open space and planning on the waterfront. And for me, a floating pool or pools could be a part of that solution. But to me, that's really where a lot of waterfront planning is starting to go. Obviously, the big change in plans on the East River Park are a major step, but we're going to need more of that, hear more of that, and as New Yorkers are going to have to embrace it. There's going to be need to be change on the waterfront in order to protect our city.
And what if they clean up the sewer outfalls, the combined sewer outfalls? We can swim in the river.
There's an idea.
There's an idea.
All right. Well, with that, thank you both for providing a history for public pools. A real physical history for that, as well as a knowledge base, and for making parks for the people on the waterfront. So thanks, Anne and Regina, for joining us tonight and for what you've done in your careers.
Oh,
thank you for having me. And
thank you, Carol. Thank you for bringing us together. This was a real treat for me. Me
too. So join us next time, folks, when we will have in early July for something completely different, Moscow Monumental, to talk about Stalin's setback skyscrapers. And then later in July, Kyo Mo, who will talk about his book, a very clever title, Unless, to prove that less is more sort of, or maybe not, when you look at the Seagram building and how it impacts the technology of extraction industries. So come back then for theoretical and historical inquiries in the same spirit as this evening. So thanks everybody for joining us, and see you next time.
Bye.
Bye. Hello, everybody. It's 6 o'clock and time for our book talk for June, actually our second book talk for June. I'm not starting this evening with the book cover so that we have a kind of cautionary approach to our technology, but as you all know, tonight's talk is the floating pool lady, as introduced by, and you see her on the screen now, Ann Buttenwieser, who is indeed the floating pool lady. Ann is a longtime friend and colleague. In fact, I have taught a class with her at Columbia for more than 25 years. So a good deal of the history of this amazing project, the floating swimming pool, is something that I lived through in many chapters of our teaching career, because there really is a really strong teaching element that is described in the narrative of Anne's, in one way, delightful book, and another way informative and also frustrating, in the sense that I guess Robert Moses described that public works is a dangerous game. And as Anne used to say often to me after our class at Columbia, or maybe before, in order to explain how she'd been up late at night, no good deed goes unpunished. While you are already seeing her screen share, which will provide a little bit of the historical context for the inspiration for creating the floating swimming pool, and perhaps we'd all, on this really hot and humid day in New York, be diving into the pool rather than to be listening about it. We will nevertheless introduce you through a series of images first, as Anne talks about the pool project. And then we're going to be joined by our special guest for the evening, who is also a longtime friend and colleague of Anne's, Regina Meyer, who practiced as a planner in the Department of City Planning, as did Anne several decades ago. Anne also worked at the EDC. She has been a parks advocate. There's a long resume that actually she and Regina will talk about in the dialogue after a short visual presentation and an explanation of the pool. And I thought it would be particularly interesting to have the two of them together, because they went through so much together in thinking about how you open up and especially industrial waterfront, a historical industrial waterfront, to public use and to the public realm. And so Anne's project of this floating swimming pool, and Regina's project that she miraculously brought to fruition, the Brooklyn Bridge Park, are parallel experiences in their professional planning life. And I thought it would be both a kind of insider's story that talks about government and the challenges of bringing projects like this into existence, of birthing them on the waterfront, and also be a particularly well-informed policy discussion and kind of planning, not so much the planning practice discussion about just how challenging it is for projects like this to move forward. So at this point, I am going to turn my camera off and let Anne use her screen share in order to give us a quick overview of the history that leads up to her floating pool. And then before I leave, I want to invite you to add your chats, your questions, to the chat box, which I can then discreetly look at while Anne and Regina are conversing, and introduce some of your questions into the conversation. So Anne Buttenwieser, I'm giving it over to you as I leave the screen. And Anne, take it away.